Every empire that has ever tried to conquer Afghanistan has eventually left. The British tried 3 times. The Soviet Union spent a decade there and collapsed shortly after walking away. The United States and NATO poured in 20 years, trillions of dollars, and the most sophisticated military in human history. And in the end, the same group that was in power before they arrived was back in power when they left. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. And to understand why it keeps happening, you have to understand what Afghanistan actually is, not as a country on a map, but as a place, a patchwork, and a problem that has defeated every outside attempt to solve it. This is why Afghanistan never stabilized. Start with the geography, because it explains almost everything. Afghanistan sits at the crossroads of Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. It shares borders with Iran, Pakistan, China, and 3 former Soviet republics. For centuries, it was the hinge through which armies, traders, and empires moved between East and West. That position made it strategically valuable. It also made it a permanent target. The terrain is brutal. The Hindu Kush mountain range cuts through the center of the country. Vast deserts stretch to the south and west. Most of the land is either too dry, too rugged, or too remote to govern easily from a central capital. Kabul is the political heart, but Kabul is not Afghanistan. The provinces lie by their own rhythms, their own loyalties, their own rules, and the people reflect that fragmentation. Afghanistan is not one people. It is a mosaic. Pashtuns make up the largest group, mostly in the south and east. Tajiks dominate much of the north and west. Hazaras, historically persecuted, are concentrated in the central highlands. Uzbeks, Turkmens, and other communities add to the mix. These are not just ethnic categories. They are political identities built around tribe, clan, language, and long memory. The modern borders of Afghanistan were not drawn by Afghans. They were drawn by outside powers. The British Empire, managing its rivalry with Russia in the 19th century, fixed Afghanistan's boundaries as a buffer zone. The Duran Line, drawn in 1893, split the Pashtun population between British India and Afghanistan. That line became the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, a border that Pashtuns on both sides have never fully accepted. So before any modern conflict began, Afghanistan was already a state with artificial borders, deep ethnic divisions, impossible terrain, and no tradition of centralized authority. Power in Afghanistan had always been negotiated between kings and warlords, between Kabul and the provinces, between the center and the periphery. That negotiation broke down completely in the 20th century, and when it did, the consequences were catastrophic. Afghanistan's modern collapse has a specific starting point, 1978. That year, a communist coup overthrew the Afghan government. The new regime tried to impose radical reforms, land redistribution, changes to marriage laws, mass literacy campaigns, and a deeply conservative, rural society. The reaction was immediate and violent. Revolts broke out across the country. The new government began killing its own people. The Soviet Union, watching a communist ally disintegrate on its southern border, decided to intervene. In December 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan and installed a more controllable leader. They expected a quick stabilization. They got a decade-long guerrilla war. What followed was one of the Cold War's most destructive proxy conflicts. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan poured money and weapons into the Afghan resistance. The Mujahideen, the goal was not to build Afghanistan. The goal was to bleed the Soviet Union. It worked. The Soviets lost over 15,000 soldiers. Millions of Afghans were killed or displaced. Roughly a third of the population fled the country. In 1989, the Soviets withdrew. It was a humiliation that contributed to the unraveling of the Soviet Union itself. But what happened next is just as important, and it is often skipped over. When the Soviets left, the United States largely lost interest in Afghanistan. The proxy war was over. The Cold War was ending. Afghanistan was no longer useful. The funding dried up. The attention moved elsewhere. Afghanistan was left with a destroyed economy, a shattered government, millions of weapons in circulation, and dozens of armed factions with no common enemy and no shared vision for the future. The civil war that followed was savage. Warlords divided the country between them. Kabul was reduced to rubble by factions that had previously fought together against the Soviets. The state essentially ceased to exist. Out of that chaos, in the mid-1990s, came the Taliban. The Taliban emerged from the Pashtun South, initially among religious students and fighters who had grown up in the refugee camps of Pakistan. Their message was simple: we will end the chaos, impose order, and governed by strict Islamic law. For many Afghans exhausted by years of warlord violence, that offer had real appeal. By 1996, the Taliban controlled Kabul. By the late 1990s, they controlled most of the country. They harbored al-Qaeda, the jihadist network led by Osama bin Laden, which had found Afghanistan a convenient base of operations. Then came September 11, 2001. The United States invaded Afghanistan within weeks. The Taliban government collapsed rapidly. Bin Laden and much of al-Qaeda leadership fled. A new Afghan government was established in Kabul. NATO allies joined the mission. For a brief moment, there was a real possibility of a different outcome. But the mission almost immediately became something it wasn't designed to be. What started as a counterterrorism operation gradually transformed into a state-building project. The United States and its allies set out to build a modern, democratic, centrally governed Afghan state. In a country where none of those things had ever been firmly established, the problems compounded quickly. The Taliban were not destroyed. They retreated across the border into Pakistan's tribal areas, regrouped, and began a steady insurgency. Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban was always deeply ambiguous. The Pakistani military saw the Taliban as a strategic asset, a way to maintain influence in Afghanistan and prevent Indian encirclement. That meant the insurgency always had a sanctuary. Meanwhile, the Afghan government the U.S. was building was riddled with corruption. Warlords who had been brought into the coalition were enriching themselves. Foreign aid was being stolen at enormous scale. The government in Kabul was seen by many Afghans not as a legitimate authority but as a vehicle for factional power and foreign money. The United States surged troops in 2009 and again in 2010. There were genuine military gains, but military pressure alone could not fix a government that its own people didn't trust. The fundamental contradiction was never resolved. You cannot build a stable state from the outside if the state's own institutions are captured by people looting it, and if the population in the rural South and East sees the government as foreign-backed and corrupt. The Taliban never stopped fighting. They were patient. They knew the foreigners would eventually leave. By the time the Trump administration signed a withdrawal agreement with the Taliban in 2020, negotiated without the Afghan government present at the table, the writing was on the wall. The Biden administration followed through on the withdrawal in 2021. The collapse of the Afghan government was faster than almost anyone publicly predicted. Within days of the final U.S. withdrawal, the Taliban swept across the country. Afghan security forces, trained and equipped for 2 decades at enormous cost, melted away. Many simply stopped fighting. The fall of Kabul in August 2021 was not just a military event. It was an answer to a question that the entire 20-year project had been avoiding. Had a viable Afghan state actually been built? The answer, when tested, was no. This does not mean nothing changed in 20 years. It did. Girls had gone to school. A generation had grown up with different expectations. Civil society had developed in ways that didn't exist before. Those things were real, and their loss was real. But the central project, a self-sustaining, legitimate, functioning government capable of holding the country together, had not taken root deeply enough to survive on its own, and the reasons trace all the way back to everything that came before. The ethnic fragmentation that made unity fragile, the terrain that made central authority difficult, the corruption that hollowed out the state, the Pakistani sanctuary that kept the insurgency alive. The history of external interference that made any foreign-backed government suspect in the eyes of many Afghans. No single decision made it inevitable, but the accumulation of geography, history, and political failure made it very hard to avoid. Afghanistan has never stabilized because stability, as the outside world imagined it, required something Afghanistan had never had: a broadly legitimate central government, accepted across its many ethnic and regional divides, strong enough to hold together a country that was always more a collection of communities than a unified state. Every foreign power that tried to impose that stability ended up fighting the country's complexity. Every government that relied on outside support found that support finite. Every group that was excluded from power eventually found a way to disrupt the arrangement. What the Afghan story reveals is one of the hardest lessons in geopolitics. You can topple a government easily, but you cannot build a state on someone else's behalf. States grow out of their own history, their own compromises, their own conflicts, resolved over time from within. Afghanistan's conflicts are not resolved. The Taliban govern now, but they face their own insurgencies, their own economic collapse, and their own ethnic tensions. The cycle has not ended. It has simply entered a new phase, and the world, having tried and failed once again to change Afghanistan from the outside, is watching and mostly looking away.